Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the streets slick and cold under the early light. James sat in the driver's seat of his car, gripping the steering wheel with hands that had long since gone numb. The engine idled, a low hum that kept him anchored to the present. He glanced at the garage door, half open, the glow from a lone bulb casting pale light over the boxes stacked inside. Diane had left it like that the day before when she hurried out for another work trip. It was always work trips now, always destinations that felt too familiar for comfort. He rubbed his temples, feeling the sting of exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. James, 44, father to a bright 17-year-old named Sonia and husband to Diane for more than a decade, used to feel proud when he told people he was married. Theirs was a union that friends envied, full of laughter and the easy banter that came with years of companionship. He still remembered the early days, when Diane's smile could turn the worst day around, when they planned vacations and talked late into the night about Sonia's future. But all of that had been slowly eroded, replaced by a hollow routine and silence that stretched longer with each passing day. The first crack appeared 6 months ago, a tiny splinter in the trust that once seemed unbreakable. Diane, in her crisp professional suits, began leaving more often. Orlando. Houston. Meetings that lasted a day longer than they should, dinners that stretched into unexplained absences. At first, he told himself it was just the price of her career. She was always ambitious, always driven. He wanted to be the supportive husband, the one who nodded and smiled when she recounted her work stories. But soon, her stories grew vague, littered with details that didn't add up. James didn't consider himself a suspicious man. He was steady, logical, a planner. He managed finances for a mid-sized firm and liked numbers more than confrontation. But when Diane's trips became monthly, then bi-weekly, he felt something gnawing at the edge of his peace. It was a suspicion that came in whispers, an unease that kept him awake long after she had returned home, smiling too brightly, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his. It was a Thursday afternoon when the cracks finally widened into a chasm. James had taken a day off to clear the garage, an overdue chore that had weighed on him for months. It was there, between stacks of holiday decorations and old camping gear, that he found it, a small suitcase wedged behind a row of paint cans. He almost left it alone, dismissing it as one of Sonia's forgotten school projects or a piece of luggage Diane hadn't used in years. But something in him, the same nagging instinct that had kept him tossing in bed, made him pause. He set the suitcase on the workbench, wiping dust off the faded fabric before flicking open the latch. Inside, a collection of souvenirs lay neatly packed. Keychains from Tampa, a snow globe from Denver, postcards with handwritten notes. James frowned. Diane had never mentioned Tampa or Denver, not once in all the years they'd talked about her trips. He picked up one of the postcards, turning it over to read the looping script, "Thinking of you in our next adventure." No signature. The room swam, a wave of nausea rolling through him as he sank onto an old lawn chair. For a moment, he simply sat, staring at the contents of the suitcase as if they might disappear if he blinked enough. But they didn't. The truth, stark and ugly, was now laid out in front of him, undeniable. He wasn't sure how long he sat there before the low hum of the garage door opener broke the silence. Diane's car pulled in, her silhouette framed by the driver's side window. James quickly shoved the suitcase back behind the paint cans, heart hammering in his chest as he tried to compose himself. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the concrete, eyes skimming over him as if he were a stranger. "Hey, didn't expect to see you home," she said, her voice too cheerful, too rehearsed. "Yeah," he replied, forcing his expression into something neutral. "Decided to tackle the garage." She nodded, setting her purse on a shelf. "Looks like you made progress." James watched her, searching for a hint of guilt or recognition, but her face remained smooth, unbothered. It was then that he knew, whatever he had found in that suitcase was only a fraction of the story. And if Diane was hiding this, there had to be more. The next few days passed in a blur. Diane left for another trip, Orlando again, and James began to put pieces together. He scoured their shared computer, going through browser history, email drafts, anything that might illuminate the truth. And there it was, in an email chain buried deep in her inbox, between Diane and someone named Jeremy. At first, the words seemed harmless, a discussion about pharmaceuticals and conference schedules. But then, a shift in tone, inside jokes, references to late-night dinners, shared secrets. James felt like a man grasping at thin air, every confirmation of his suspicion stealing more of his breath. The hardest part was acting normal when Diane returned, smiling and tucking her hair behind her ear like nothing had changed. He forced himself to kiss her goodnight, hold conversations over breakfast, all the while feeling the weight of his silence bearing down on him. It was a Sunday when he finally faced himself in the bathroom mirror, dark circles smudged under his eyes, a man haunted by the specter of betrayal. The phone in his pocket buzzed, a reminder to himself, set earlier that week, plan ahead. James took a deep breath and knew he couldn't let this go unchallenged. The days after that Sunday felt like a cruel test of endurance, each moment pulling at James' resolve as he quietly collected pieces of a story he wished he could forget. Diane moved through the house with practiced ease, her laughter ringing out in casual conversations and her smile reaching her eyes in a way that seemed so genuine, so painfully deceptive. James began to notice the subtleties of her routine, the moments she excused herself to take calls in their room, the overly detailed stories she told about mundane meetings, and the way her gaze flickered to her phone whenever a notification buzzed. The research James did at night, alone at the dining table or hunched over his laptop in the den, revealed more than he had braced himself for. He uncovered credit card charges to restaurants and hotels in cities Diane had never mentioned. The worst of it came when he tracked down some of those places online, intimate bistros with dim lighting and wine lists that promised whispered conversations in secluded booths. But even as he unraveled the details, James couldn't bring himself to confront her, not yet. Confrontation felt like jumping off a ledge without knowing how far down the bottom was. He needed certainty, needed to prepare for the impact that would follow. So, he played the role of a husband who suspected nothing, who was too caught up in work and life to notice the way the ground shifted beneath his feet. That week, Diane mentioned she was planning another trip, this time to Houston. She announced it over breakfast, casually, as if it was a minor inconvenience. "It's just for 2 nights," she said, folding a piece of toast and taking a bite. "I'll be back by Friday." James nodded, keeping his expression steady. "Another conference?" "Yeah, some new product launch they want me to oversee," Diane said, her eyes skimming the kitchen as if looking for something more interesting than his face. "Nothing too exciting." "Sounds important," he replied, stirring his coffee to keep his hands busy. The metal spoon clinked against the ceramic mug, a sharp reminder that everything about this was real. Diane smiled, and for a moment, he almost believed it was the same smile she'd given him in the first years of their marriage, bright and full of promises they'd kept. But then her phone buzzed, and her gaze shifted so quickly that the illusion shattered. That night, after Sonia went to bed, James stayed up, scrolling through months of Diane's messages and emails on her laptop. It had taken weeks to gather enough evidence without tipping her off. He knew her password, they'd shared it years ago when setting up their joint accounts and never bothered to change it. It felt like betrayal to use it now, but James reminded himself that betrayal had already found its way into their home, and it wasn't by his doing. The messages with Jeremy painted an undeniable picture. Their first exchange had been innocuous enough, work talk, shared articles, updates on conferences. But somewhere along the way, the tone shifted. A few lines buried deep in their correspondence nearly made him slam the laptop shut. "Last night was amazing. Wish we could make it happen more often. Counting the days to Houston." James stared at the words until they blurred, the room around him fading into a dull hum. His pulse drummed in his ears, and he felt a raw, primal rage coursed through him. But with it came a strange calm, the kind that settled in before a storm. He'd found what he needed. Now, it was time to act. The next morning, James sat at his desk at work, barely hearing the chatter of his colleagues around him. He pulled out a legal pad and started a list, detailing everything he needed to do. Contact a lawyer. Secure finances. Gather records. Each bullet point felt like a step closer to reclaiming his own narrative, one that had been hijacked and twisted by Diane's choices. But the hardest part was Sonia. He glanced at the framed photo of her on his desk, a snapshot from her last school play, her smile wide and confident. She adored Diane, clung to her stories and laughter like a lifeline. The idea of shattering that illusion for Sonia made James' chest tighten. But he knew that protecting her from this lie was more important than preserving it. Later that evening, as Diane packed her suitcase in their bedroom, James lingered in the doorway. The room was filled with the familiar scent of her perfume, a warm, floral blend that used to comfort him but now felt suffocating. "Need any help?" he asked, the words feeling strange, like someone else had spoken them. She glanced over her shoulder, startled. "No, I'm good, thanks," she said, folding a silk blouse and tucking it neatly into the case. "Just making sure I've got everything for tomorrow." James nodded and stepped inside, picking up a book from her nightstand and flipping through it absent-mindedly. He wanted to say something, anything that would push through the mask she wore so effortlessly. But instead, he let the silence hang between them, heavy and suffocating. When she left for the airport the next day, James stood by the window, watching her car disappear down the street. The house felt too big, too empty, and he wondered how long it had been since it truly felt like home. But as the quiet settled around him, a steely determination replaced the grief. It was time for Diane to learn that betrayal was a path paved with consequences. James picked up the phone, his fingers steady as he dialed the lawyer's number he had memorized. The line rang twice before a clipped, professional voice answered. "Hello, this is Margaret Stein, how can I assist you?" "I need to discuss a divorce," James said, his voice low but unwavering. "And I need to know what I'm up against." James spent the next few days meticulously arranging his strategy. He met with Margaret Stein, the divorce lawyer he had called, in a modest office downtown. The room was lined with leather-bound books, their spines cracked from use, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and paperwork. Margaret was a sharp woman in her early 50s, with short-cropped silver hair and eyes that seemed to see past any pretense. James found comfort in her no-nonsense demeanor. "Let me be clear," she said, setting down her pen and folding her hands. "If we pursue this, it needs to be airtight. No room for her to twist it back on you. You said you've collected evidence." James nodded, sliding over a folder filled with printed screenshots, credit card statements, and travel itineraries. He had spent late nights printing out each piece, organizing them until they told a coherent story. Margaret glanced through the pages, her expression impassive but her eyes scanning rapidly. "This is solid," she said after a moment. "But it won't be easy. People don't react well when their carefully built illusions come crashing down." James let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "I know," he said. "But I can't let her pretend everything's fine anymore. Not when it's already broken." Margaret nodded, tapping her fingers against her desk. "We'll get started on this right away. In the meantime, do not let on that you know. If she senses what's coming, it could complicate everything." Walking out of the office, James felt a mixture of dread and relief. He was finally doing something tangible, something that would bring back a sense of control. But the reality of dismantling his marriage, of pulling Sonia into this mess, loomed over him like a storm cloud. That evening, he returned home to find Sonia at the kitchen table, a half-empty bowl of cereal in front of her as she scrolled on her phone. She looked up and gave him a smile that lit up her whole face. "Hey, Dad," she said, putting her phone down. "How was work?" "It was fine, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile. "How was school?" "Good. We started working on our projects for the science fair." Mrs. Callahan said mine was one of the best ideas she'd seen. James' heart ached as he listened to her talk. Sonia was bright, kind, and deserved a world that wasn't fractured. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from what was coming, but he knew there was no easy way through this. "Dad?" Sonia's voice pulled him back. "Is something wrong?" "No, just tired," James said, patting her hand gently. "But I'm proud of you, you know that." She smiled, a flash of joy in her eyes. "I know." The next morning, Diane called from Houston. James let the call go to voicemail, unable to trust himself to stay composed while listening to her practiced voice. Instead, he listened to the message hours later when the house was empty. "Hey, James. Just wanted to check in and see how things are going at home. The conference is a little dull, but I'll be back tomorrow. Give Sonia a hug for me, okay? Love you." The way she said it, "love you," with no tremor, no hesitation, sent a chill down his spine. He replayed the message twice, looking for cracks in her facade but finding none. How long had she perfected that tone, the one that masked betrayal under layers of normalcy? James turned his attention to the phone records he'd pulled up on his computer. The number tied to Jeremy appeared again, buried among routine calls. The details lined up too well with the time she was supposedly away for work. He noted each instance, building the story brick by brick until it stood tall and unyielding. The final confirmation came when Diane returned late the next evening. James heard her keys jingle at the door and the familiar sound of her heels on the tile. She breezed in, her hair tied back and a smile on her face as she dropped her overnight bag by the stairs. "Hey," she said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. The scent of her perfume reached him, the same one he'd caught on her when she returned from trips, mingled now with the faintest trace of something unfamiliar. "Hey," James replied, stepping back and shoving his hands into his pockets to keep them from trembling. He watched as she glanced around, her eyes catching on the bills stacked neatly on the table. "Everything okay here?" she asked, nodding towards the pile. "Yeah. Just some paperwork I had to sort through," he said. He kept his gaze level, his voice steady. Diane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she turned away, dismissing the subtle tension that buzzed between them. Sonia came bounding down the stairs, her face lighting up at the sight of her mother. "Mom! You're back," she said, throwing her arms around Diane. Diane laughed, the sound genuine and soft, and James felt something twist inside him. It was the laugh he used to treasure, now an echo of everything that had gone wrong. He watched as Diane pressed a kiss to Sonia's head, the picture of a devoted mother, while the truth sat heavy and sharp in his chest. That night, after the house had gone quiet, James sat in the living room, staring at the darkened TV screen. The silence was deafening. He replayed every smile, every touch, every lie that had led them here. He felt the weight of the next steps pressing down on him, but the fear was different now. It wasn't paralyzing. It was the kind that pushed you forward, even when the path was uncertain. Diane's phone buzzed from the kitchen counter, muted trill that broke the stillness. James glanced at it, the name Jeremy flashing across the screen for a moment before the notification disappeared. He stood, feeling the final shreds of his patience slip away. There was no turning back now. James waited until the early morning light bled through the edges of the curtains before confronting Diane. He had spent the hours before in the living room, pacing, replaying everything that led to this moment. The quiet of the house felt fragile, as if even the smallest sound could shatter it. Diane stirred in their bedroom, the creak of the mattress announcing her movement. James heard her footsteps on the wooden floor, her voice low as she called for Sonia, who was still asleep in her room down the hall. The sun had barely risen, casting a gray, somber light over the world outside. He stood at the base of the stairs, hands clasped tightly behind him, forcing himself to stay composed. Diane emerged in her robe, her hair tousled, eyes half closed with sleep. She stopped when she saw him standing there, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "James? What's wrong?" she asked, voice laced with the kind of concern that used to soothe him but now felt like salt on an open wound. "We need to talk," he said, each word deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Her brows furrowed, and she glanced behind her, as if looking for an escape. "Can it wait? Sonia's going to wake up any." "No, it can't," he interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. Diane's eyes widened, and he saw fear seep in around the edges of her composure. "I know, Diane. About everything." The silence that followed was palpable. Diane's mouth opened, then closed, her face paling as the realization settled over her. The strength she usually wielded so easily seemed to slip through her fingers. She took a hesitant step toward him, eyes pleading. "James, please." "No," he cut her off, holding up a hand. "Don't lie. Not anymore." Diane's hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself. She looked so different, stripped of the confidence and easy smile she had worn for so long. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice cracking. James' jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter. You made choices, Diane. You chose him. You chose this." The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Diane pressed her fingers to her mouth, stifling a sob. "I thought I could fix it," she said, tears trailing down her cheeks. "I thought I could come back and make it right." He stared at her, the woman he had built his life around, the mother of his child, and felt an aching hollowness spread through him. "But you can't, can you?" he said softly, his voice devoid of the anger he expected to feel. "There's no going back." Before Diane could answer, a soft sound came from the hallway. Sonia stood in the shadows, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She had woken up to the sound of raised voices, to the tremor of emotions that had seeped through the walls. "Mom. Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. James turned, the ache in his chest deepening as he met his daughter's gaze. This was the moment he had feared, the one that would etch itself into her memory and haunt them both. Diane's expression crumpled, and she reached for Sonia, but the girl instinctively pulled back, the distance between them stretching wider than the hallway that separated them. "Sonia," Diane said, her voice breaking. "It's not what you think." But Sonia wasn't listening. She looked at her father, searching for answers, for reassurance that things weren't as bad as they seemed. James stepped forward, swallowing hard, trying to keep his own tears at bay. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about some things," he said, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound strong. But Sonia shook her head, taking a step back. "No," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I don't want to hear it." The weight of the moment crushed James, and he knew there was nothing he could say that would make this right. He watched as Sonia turned and ran to her room, the sound of the door slamming shut echoing through the house. Diane's sobs grew louder, her body folding in on itself as she sank to the floor. James stood there, feeling as if he had lost more than just his marriage. The quiet house, once a place of comfort, now felt haunted by their collective grief. The sound of Diane's muffled cries mixed with the silence that followed Sonia's retreat, creating a cacophony of pain that he would carry for the rest of his life. He sat down on the stairs, feeling every ounce of exhaustion press into his bones. The fight had left him, replaced by an emptiness that words couldn't fill. As the first rays of morning sun stretched across the floor, illuminating the scene of their unraveling, James knew that some things, once broken, could never be pieced back together. And in that light, he realized that the hardest part was not the betrayal or the anger, but the loss of what they once were, a family that, in one irreversible moment, had become a collection of broken parts, each left to find their way through the wreckage alone.